The morning had a strange kind of silence to it, the kind that didn't feel peaceful but heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen, and Evelyn Carter noticed. At the moment the car slowed down on that long, uneven road, the tires crunching softly against loose gravel as fields stretched endlessly on both sides, empty and forgotten, and she sat there in the passenger seat, her hands resting tightly in her lap, fingers slightly trembling not from weakness alone, but from something deeper she couldn't quite name. Yet something that had been building quietly inside her for weeks, maybe months, ever since everything in her life began shifting in ways she couldn't control. And beside her, Marcus drove in complete silence, his face unreadable, eyes fixed ahead. Like this was just another routine task he needed to complete. And when the car finally came to a stop in front of the old house, he let out a breath that sounded more like relief than concern, and that was the moment Evelyn understood something was very wrong. Because this wasn't how a husband looked when he brought his wife somewhere to heal. This was how someone looked when they were finally done carrying a burden, and she turned her head slowly. Her body still not fully responsive after the medical episode that had changed everything. And her gaze landed on the house, a structure that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself, the paint peeling off in layers, the porch leaning slightly to one side, windows clouded with dust and neglect, and tall, dry grass surrounding it like it had been. Left alone for years, and for a moment she couldn't speak, her throat tightening as she tried to process what she was seeing, and when she finally did, her voice came out quieter than she expected, almost fragile. This? This is where I'm supposed to stay? And Marcus didn't look at her immediately. Instead, he turned off the engine, adjusted his sleeves, and stepped out of the car before answering, like he needed a second to prepare his tone. And when he came around to her side and opened the door, his expression was carefully neutral, not cold, not warm, just distant, and he nodded slightly. It's quiet here, peaceful, exactly what you need right now. And the word peaceful echoed in her mind in a way that didn't comfort her at all, because nothing about this place felt like healing. It felt like isolation, like being placed somewhere out of sight, out of reach, and she noticed the woman standing near the porch, watching them with a detached expression, older, uninterested, like this was just another routine day for her. And Marcus followed her gaze and said casually, "That's Linda. She'll check on you, make sure everything's fine, check on you, not care for you, not stay with you, just check." And Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, but she stayed silent, because arguing took energy she didn't have, and he helped her out of the car carefully, almost gently, but there was no emotion behind it, just obligation. And as he placed her into the chair, she felt the weight of the situation settle over her, not as sadness, but as realization, something deep and undeniable. And when he stepped back and said, "You'll be better off here." For a while, she looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, anything. But there was nothing there except distance, and when he added, "I'll come visit." Every couple of weeks, it sounded more like a promise he didn't intend to keep, and she nodded slowly, not because she believed him, but because she understood him now. And she watched as he carried her bags inside, placed them near the doorway, gave a quick glance around like he was confirming everything was in place, and then, without hesitation, he turned and walked back outside, and she followed his movement with her eyes as he got into the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. And she sat there, completely still, staring at the empty road long after the sound of the car disappeared, her fingers gripping the armrests tightly. And in that silence, something inside her didn't break the way she thought it would. Instead, it sharpened, became clearer, because for the first time in months, she understood exactly what had just happened. She hadn't been brought here to recover. She had been removed, quietly, conveniently, placed somewhere she wouldn't interfere anymore, and the thought should have crushed her. Should have. Broken whatever strength she had left, but instead, it did something unexpected. It ignited something. Something small but steady, and she closed her eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath, and when she opened them again, the fear that had been sitting inside her for weeks felt different. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't controlling her anymore. Because now there was something else standing beside it, something stronger, something that had been buried under trust, under love, under years of believing she was safe, and that. Something was awareness, and awareness turned quickly into anger, not loud, not explosive, but quiet, controlled, and far more dangerous, because Evelyn Carter wasn't as weak as they thought she was, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives by believing she wouldn't fight back. The first night in that house didn't feel like a beginning, it felt like an ending that no one had given her permission to refuse, and yet Evelyn Carter refused it anyway, without saying a single word, because as darkness slowly filled the rooms and the faint sounds of wind brushing against the cracked windows echoed through the space, she sat there in silence, her mind replaying every moment that had led her here, every look Marcus had given her over the past few months, every conversation that now felt rehearsed, calculated, and distant. And it was strange how clarity came, not in loud realizations, but in quiet patterns. Because now she could see it clearly. The shift hadn't started after her condition, it had started long before that, when the inheritance came into their lives, when that letter had arrived with her name written neatly across the front. A letter that carried news of her late grandmother's estate, a property, and a significant financial amount that neither she nor Marcus had ever expected, and she remembered the way his eyes had lit up that evening, the way his tone had softened, the way his attention had suddenly returned after months of emotional distance. And back then she had believed it was relief, believed it was love trying to find its way back. But now, sitting alone in that empty house, she understood the truth was far colder than that. Because Marcus hadn't come back to her, he had come back to what she had received. And that realization didn't make her cry the way she thought it would. Instead, it made her feel something heavier, something steadier, like a foundation shifting beneath her feet, but not collapsing, just revealing what was real and what had always been illusion. And she slowly pushed herself up from the chair that night, her legs trembling slightly, but holding, because what Marcus didn't know, what no one knew, was that her recovery had been stronger than she had allowed them to see, not because she wanted to deceive them, but because something in her had needed to understand the truth before she acted on it. And now that truth stood in front of her clearly, and she took one step, then another, her movements slow but controlled, until she reached the window and looked out at the darkness stretching across the land. And for the first time since everything had changed, she didn't feel trapped. She felt aware, and awareness was far more powerful than fear, because fear kept her still, but awareness gave her direction. And she stood there for a long time, thinking not about what she had lost, but about what had been taken from her. Because there was a difference, and that difference mattered. Because losing something meant it was gone forever. But having something taken meant it could be reclaimed, and that thought stayed with her as she moved through the house slowly, exploring it room by room, noticing the broken fixtures, the dust-covered surfaces, the silence that filled every corner, and instead of feeling abandoned, she began to feel something else entirely, something unexpected, possibility. Because if this place had been left behind, it meant no one else had claimed it. And if no one else had claimed it, then maybe, just maybe, It could belong to her in a way nothing else ever had. And that idea settled quietly in her mind as she finally lay down that night, exhaustion pulling her into a restless sleep, and when morning came, it didn't arrive with dread the way she expected. It arrived with light, soft sunlight filtering through the worn curtains, touching everything gently as if the house itself was waking up with her, and she sat up slowly, her body aching but responsive, and for a moment she just breathed, deep and steady, letting the air fill her lungs fully, something she hadn't done properly in weeks, and that was when she made her first real decision. Not out loud, not dramatic, just a quiet choice that shifted everything. She wasn't going to wait here. She wasn't going to fade into the background of someone else's plan. And she wasn't going to let Marcus decide how her story ended. And the moment that decision settled inside her, everything around her felt different. Because now this house wasn't a place she had been left to disappear, it was a place she could rebuild from. And rebuilding didn't start with big actions, it started small, with movement, with effort, with reclaiming control piece by piece. And she spent that entire day pushing herself, cleaning surfaces, opening windows, letting fresh air replace the stale heaviness that had settled into the walls, and every small task felt like a statement, a quiet refusal to accept what had been planned for her, and as hours passed, her body grew tired, but her mind grew sharper, clearer, and sometime in the afternoon, as she rested briefly near the doorway, she heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching, and instinctively her body tensed, her heart picking up speed, because for a split second she thought Marcus had returned. But when the truck pulled up and a man stepped out, unfamiliar, calm, and observant, she felt that tension shift into something else, caution mixed with curiosity, and he walked closer, stopping a few steps away, his expression steady, not intrusive, just present, and he nodded. Slightly, didn't expect anyone to be living here again, he said, his voice low, and even Evelyn studied him for a moment before responding, her tone calm despite everything. I didn't expect to be here either, and something in her answer seemed to register with him, not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them, and he gave a small, understanding nod before adding, "Name's Daniel. I live a few miles down the road." And she nodded back slowly, "Evelyn," and there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just quiet, and then he glanced around at the house, the open windows, the signs of recent movement, and said, "You fixing it up?" And for a second she hesitated, because saying yes meant committing to something she hadn't fully built yet, but then she straightened slightly and answered, "I am," and the simplicity of those two words carried more weight than she expected, because they weren't just about the house, they were about her, about everything she had decided without saying it out loud. And Daniel didn't question her further, didn't pry, he just nodded again and said, "If you need tools or help, just ask." And with that, he turned back toward his truck, leaving her standing there with something new settling into her chest. Not dependence, not relief, but recognition. Recognition that not everyone in her life was there to take from her. Some people simply existed without expectation. And as she watched him drive away, she realized something important. Marcus had isolated her because he believed isolation would weaken her, but what he hadn't considered was that isolation could also give her space. Space to think, to see clearly, to rebuild without interference. And that realization made her lips curve slightly for the first time in what felt like months, because for the first time since everything fell apart, she wasn't reacting anymore. She was choosing, and that changed everything. What Evelyn Carter didn't realize at first was that clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers. peeling back slowly, revealing truths that were always there but easier to ignore when life felt stable. And in the quiet days that followed, as she continued cleaning, repairing, and pushing her body further than she had in months, her mind began connecting pieces she hadn't fully processed before. Small details that once seemed insignificant now forming a pattern too. Clear to deny, because Marcus hadn't just distanced himself emotionally, he had been preparing, step by step, quietly, carefully, for a life that didn't include her. And the more she thought about it, the more everything started to make sense in a way that made her chest tighten, not with sadness, but with something colder, something sharper, because this wasn't neglect, this wasn't confusion, this was intention, and intention changed everything. It began with the messages she remembered seeing one night weeks before everything collapsed, when Marcus had stepped out onto the balcony with his phone, speaking in a voice so low she could barely hear it, but she remembered the tone, soft, familiar, a tone he hadn't used with her in months, and at the time she had dismissed it, told herself she was imagining things, but now sitting alone at the small table in that house, her hands resting over old papers and documents she had brought with her, she realized she hadn't imagined anything at all. She had simply chosen not to confront it yet. And that realization was enough to push her into action, because for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what she might find. She needed to know. That afternoon, she reached for her phone and dialed the only person she trusted enough to speak the truth without hesitation: Claire Donovan, her former colleague and someone who had remained distant from Marcus's influence over the years. And when Claire answered, her voice immediately shifted with concern. "Evelyn, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for weeks." And Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself before replying. "I needed time, but I need your help now." And there was a pause on the other end before Claire's tone became firm, focused. "Tell me everything." And so she did. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but clearly, explaining the move, the isolation, the way Marcus had positioned everything as care when it felt like removal. And when she finished, there was silence for a few seconds before Claire spoke again. Slower this time, more cautious. "Evelyn, there's something you need to see." And those words didn't shock her the way they should have, because somewhere deep inside, she already knew what was coming. 2 days later, Claire arrived, carrying more than just concern. She carried answers, and as they sat inside the partially restored living room, sunlight filtering through clean windows for the first time in years, Claire placed a folder on the table, her expression serious. "I didn't want to assume anything before, but when you disappeared, I started looking into things." And Evelyn didn't react immediately. She simply reached forward and opened the folder slowly, her hand steady despite what she expected to find. And inside were printed images, messages, transaction records, things that told a story she could no longer deny. Marcus and another woman, not just once, not just casually, but repeatedly, intentionally, their interactions stretching back months, maybe longer. And one message stood out more than the rest, not because of its length, but because of its clarity. "Once everything is transferred, we won't have to worry anymore." And Evelyn read it twice, not because she didn't understand it, but because she needed to feel it settle completely. And when she finally looked up at Claire, her expression wasn't broken, it wasn't even surprised. It was calm, almost too calm. And Claire studied her carefully before asking, quietly, "Are you okay?" And Evelyn leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. "I think I've been expecting this for longer than I admitted to myself." And that was the truth. Because deep down, She had felt the shift. She had just chosen not to face it fully until now, and now that it was in front of her, undeniable and complete, something inside her changed permanently. Because betrayal hurts most when it's unexpected. But when it confirms what you already felt, it doesn't break you, it strengthens you in ways that are harder to reverse. The rest of the information only reinforced what she already understood. Marcus hadn't just planned to distance himself, he had structured everything. The move, the isolation, even the financial positioning, and that realization shifted something fundamental in Evelyn's perspective. Because this was no longer about emotional betrayal. This was about control, about removal, about someone deciding her role in her own life without her consent, and that was something she refused to accept. Claire leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Evelyn, legally, things aren't as simple as he thinks. And that was when the conversation shifted from discovery to strategy. Because Claire explained everything carefully, the inheritance was solely in Evelyn's name, the property legally belonged to her, and more importantly, the financial transfers Marcus had attempted were incomplete, meaning he hadn't secured control the way he believed he had, and that piece of information landed with more impact than anything else. Because it meant one thing clearly: Marcus had acted too early, and that mistake gave Evelyn something she hadn't had before: leverage. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze resting on the documents in front of her, her mind processing everything not emotionally, but strategically. Because for the first time, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost, she was thinking about what she could do next. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, controlled. "I'm not going back." And Claire nodded immediately. "Good. Because you don't have to." And that simple confirmation carried more weight than anything else in that moment. Because it removed the last illusion of obligation she had been holding on to, and with that gone, everything else became clearer. Because now she wasn't reacting to Marcus's decisions. She was creating her own. Over the following days, everything shifted from survival to construction, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and strategically. Because Evelyn didn't rush, she didn't act out of anger. She moved carefully, deliberately, reviewing documents, organizing finances, and building a plan that would not only protect her, but ensure that Marcus would never have the control he believed he held. And at the same time, she continued rebuilding the house, the land, her routine. Because strength wasn't just about legal positioning, it was about stability, and she needed both. Daniel's presence became more frequent during this time. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, just consistent, offering help when needed, stepping back when not, and that consistency began to matter more than she expected. Because after everything she had experienced, reliability felt rare. And one evening, as they worked together repairing part of the outer fence, he glanced at her briefly and said, "You're not just fixing this place, are you?" And Evelyn paused for a second, then replied quietly, "No, I'm fixing everything." And there was no need to explain further, because some truths don't need detail, they just need recognition. And Daniel nodded slightly, understanding more than she had said. By the end of that week, Evelyn Carter was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She was someone else entirely. Someone who understood the full extent of what had been done to her, someone who had the clarity to respond instead of react, and someone who had just begun to realize that being underestimated was not a weakness, it was an advantage. Because Marcus believed she was isolated, weak, and unaware, and that belief would be the very thing that allowed her to take everything back. By the time Marcus returned, the place no longer looked the way he had left it, and that alone was enough to unsettle him before he even stepped out of the car. Because the house that had once appeared abandoned now stood clean, repaired, alive in a way that made it clear someone hadn't just stayed there, They had taken ownership of it, and as his car rolled slowly to a stop on the same gravel path, the same one he had driven down months ago with quiet relief, this time the feeling in his chest was different, heavier, uncertain, because something about this didn't match the ending he had expected. And when he stepped out, adjusting his jacket like he was preparing for a conversation he still believed he controlled, his eyes scanned the surroundings carefully, taking in the restored porch, the cleared land, the signs of work and effort that hadn't existed before. And that was when he saw her, standing near the edge of the garden, not sitting, not fragile, not waiting, but standing fully on her own, steady, composed, and for a brief second something in his expression shifted. Not concern, but surprise, because this wasn't the version of Evelyn he had left behind. This was someone else entirely, and he walked closer slowly, masking his reaction behind a controlled tone. Evelyn, you look better, he said, as if that observation alone could reset everything between them. But Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She simply turned to face him fully, her posture calm, her expression unreadable but firm, and in that moment, the silence between them felt heavier than any argument could have been, because it wasn't filled with confusion anymore, it was filled with clarity. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the hesitation it once had. I am better, she said simply. And the way she said it made it clear that her recovery wasn't just physical, it was something far deeper than that. Marcus nodded slowly, stepping closer, attempting to regain control of the conversation the only way he knew how, by shifting it into something practical, something he believed. He understood better than emotions. Good, that's good, because we need to talk about the next steps, he said, his tone slightly more assertive now, as if he was already assuming his place in whatever decision came next. But Evelyn didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't adjust her stance. She simply held her ground, and that alone disrupted the balance he expected, and when she replied, her voice remained calm, but there was something sharper underneath it. There are no wee steps anymore, Marcus, and for the first time, his expression tightened slightly, because that wasn't the response he had prepared for. He tried to recover quickly, forcing a small, controlled smile. Come on, Evelyn. Things got complicated, but we're still married, and legally. But she interrupted him before he could finish, not loudly, not aggressively, just firmly, legally. Everything you tried to control, you didn't. And those words landed harder than any accusation. Because they weren't emotional, they were factual, and Marcus's silence that followed said more than anything else could have. Because for the first time, he realized he wasn't ahead of the situation anymore, he was behind it, and that shift unsettled him more than anything else. Evelyn stepped forward slightly now, not to confront him physically, but to make something clear, and her voice remained steady as she continued. You thought bringing me here would make things easier, that I wouldn't question anything, that I wouldn't notice what you were doing. But I did, Marcus. I noticed everything, and the calm certainty in her tone removed any space for denial, because this wasn't a suspicion anymore, it was awareness. And he opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out immediately, because there was no version of this conversation where he remained in control anymore, and that realization sat heavily between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching out around them, filled only by the soft movement of wind through the trees. And then Marcus tried again, his tone lower, now less confident. Look, whatever you think happened, we can fix this, we can figure it out. And Evelyn almost smiled at that, not because it was comforting, but because it sounded exactly like what it was, an attempt to pull her back into a position where he could manage the outcome. But she didn't step into that space again. She stayed exactly where she was, and her reply was simple, final, no. You can't fix something you already decided to end. And those words closed something permanently, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, and Marcus felt it, even if he didn't want to admit it, because there was no negotiation left here, no adjustment, no middle ground, and that was something he had never experienced with her before. Just then, Daniel stepped into view from the side of the house, not rushing, not inserting himself aggressively, just present. And his presence alone shifted the dynamic further, because it made one thing clear. Evelyn wasn't alone anymore. Not emotionally, not physically, not in any way that Marcus could use to his advantage. And Marcus's gaze moved toward him briefly before returning to her, something unspoken passing through his expression. But Evelyn didn't acknowledge it, because this moment wasn't about choosing between people, it was about choosing herself, and she had already done that. "You should go, Marcus," she said finally, her tone calm but unshakable, and this time there was no room left for interpretation. And for a long second he stood there, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not the version he had grown comfortable controlling, but someone else entirely, someone who no longer fit into the life he had planned without her consent, and slowly, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his car, his steps slightly heavier than before. And when he drove away this time, it didn't feel like abandonment, it felt like closure. Evelyn stood there quietly, watching the road long after the car disappeared, not because she was waiting, but because she was letting the moment settle fully, letting everything she had carried for months finally release. And when she exhaled slowly, the tension in her body eased in a way it hadn't in a long time. And Daniel stepped closer, not too close. "Just enough, you okay?" he asked softly, and she nodded, a small but genuine smile forming for the first time. "Yeah, I am." And that simple answer carried everything. Because it wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about living again, on her own terms, without fear, without control, without being reduced to something smaller than she was. And as the sun began to lower behind the fields, casting soft golden light across the land she had rebuilt, Evelyn Carter finally understood something completely. She hadn't just escaped what Marcus had planned for her, she had outgrown it, and that was something no one could take from her again. "And now I want to ask you something. If you were in Evelyn's place, would you have stayed silent and trusted him? Or would you have done exactly what she did and rebuilt your life from nothing?" Tell me honestly in the comments, because your answer might say more about you than you think. And if this story made you feel something, if it gave you strength or reminded you of your own worth, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change everything.